A rubble-strewn street in Aachen, October 1944. A Sherman edges forward past a collapsed shop front, its commander scanning doorways that all look the same. The column has already lost one tank this morning to something that came out of a building nobody bothered to clear first. Somewhere in the wreckage ahead, a German soldier who has never fired an anti-tank weapon in his life kneels behind a low wall with a tube on his shoulder, waiting for the tank to close the last few meters. He does not need years of training for what happens next. He needs one clean shot and the nerve to let a 40-ton machine get close enough to kill him if he misses. The tank rolls past the wall. He does not miss. That tube is the Panzerfaust, a name that translates simply to armor fist, and it was never meant to be a weapon for specialists. It was meant to turn almost anyone standing behind a wall into a genuine threat to the best tank the Allies could put into the field. By the middle years of the war, German infantry faced a problem no amount of tank production could fix. Towed anti-tank guns needed a trained crew and time to dig in, neither of which infantry moving through hedgerows or rubble could reliably provide, and older anti-tank rifles had become nearly useless against the thickening armor of vehicles like the Sherman. After the enormous tank losses around Kursk in the summer of 1943, Germany shifted toward a grinding defensive war it could no longer fight with tanks alone. What it needed was a weapon requiring no crew and almost no training, something a rifleman or a 16-year-old conscript could aim once and use to kill a machine that outweighed him by 40 tons, and it had to be cheap enough to hand out by the million. Engineers at the Leipzig firm Hassag began chasing that answer in the summer of 1942, led by the engineer Heinrich Langweiler. The design vented its propellant blast out the back of a simple open tube at the same instant it pushed the warhead out the front, the two forces balancing so completely that the launcher barely kicked at all. That meant the tube could be built from thin, cheap sheet steel rather than reinforced gun steel, and any factory with minimal tooling could stamp them out. The warhead used a hollow, cone-shaped charge that collapsed its metal lining into a narrow jet traveling many times faster than a bullet. Letting something barely larger than a soup can burn through armor a far heavier conventional shell would have needed. The first 500 units left Hassag's works in August of 1943. What began as one small design became a family within a year, each version simply named for its rated range in meters. The Panzerfaust 30 weighed a little over 3 kilograms and punched through around 140 to 200 millimeters of armor at a claimed 30 meters, light enough to carry easily, but short, ranged enough that using it meant letting a tank get uncomfortably close first. The Panzerfaust 60 doubled that range at the same penetration figure, and by September of 1944, Germany was producing roughly 400,000 of them a month, an almost unimaginable output for a country running short of nearly every other raw material. The Panzerfaust 100 and 150 pushed range and penetration higher still, the heaviest topping 280 millimeters, enough on paper to defeat almost anything in the Allied or Soviet inventory. In practice, soldiers rarely trusted the printed numbers at all, engaging closer to 20 to 25 meters with the 30 and 70 to 80 meters with the 100, a full quarter or more short of what the manual promised. Every tube carried the same warning stenciled near the grip: Achtung, Feuerstrahl, beware, fire jet, because the same venting that made the weapon so light also threw a lethal blast roughly 2 meters out the back of the tube. If you're enjoying this, a subscribe helps. Now, back to what happened when millions of these reached the front line. Sherman crews met the Panzerfaust in growing numbers through the second half of 1944. In the Normandy bocage that summer, close terrain meant it accounted for only around 6% of British tank losses, since anti-tank guns were still doing most of the killing. That autumn, British armor met the same weapon in the streets of Arnhem, and by December, American crews fighting through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge faced Panzerfaust ambushes as a routine hazard in villages with nowhere to maneuver. As German gun crews and towed guns grew scarcer, the share of tank losses credited to Panzerfausts climbed toward a third in some later operations, as more of the killing shifted onto whatever infantryman happened to be holding a tube when a tank came into view. The same pattern hit the Eastern Front at the same time, where Soviet armor pushing German forces back toward East Prussia through the autumn and winter ran into Panzerfaust, defending nearly every village and river crossing along the retreat, a cheap mobile substitute for anti-tank guns that could no longer keep pace with a collapsing front. Street fighting magnified the threat further still. By the final battles inside German cities in 1945, something like 70% of tanks destroyed in that close urban fighting fell to Panzerfausts and the heavier Panzerschreck, nowhere more than in the Soviet assault on Berlin that April and May, where regular troops, militia, and Hitler Youth boys, armed with a single tube apiece, inflicted losses severe enough that Soviet commanders assigned infantry escorts, sometimes with flamethrowers, to walk tanks through the wreckage. By that point, Germany was arming children barely into their teens with a weapon simple enough that inexperience was no longer an obstacle to using it, a grim measure of how far a collapsing regime would go to keep fighting a war already lost. Set the Panzerfaust next to the American bazooka, and the difference explains why Sherman crews feared it specifically. The bazooka was a genuinely capable weapon, but it needed a rocket motor, a reusable launcher, and a trained two-man team, so it was issued sparingly and used almost exclusively by soldiers who had drilled with it. The Panzerfaust needed none of that infrastructure, and its warhead hit harder on a clean shot, punching an entry hole roughly 7 centimeters across with a lethal spray of metal inside the vehicle, against about 2.5 centimeters from the heavier Panzerschreck and barely 1 centimeter from the bazooka. Where the Allies trained specific soldiers to use their weapon and issued it accordingly, Germany handed the Panzerfaust to nearly everyone in a defensive position, so a Sherman crew rolling into any German-held town had to assume that any soldier they saw, trained or not, might be seconds from becoming a serious threat to their vehicle. A persistent myth holds that the recoilless design meant it could be fired safely from inside a sealed room. That is backward. The system did not eliminate the danger. It simply moved it to the rear of the tube, where the blast could kill anyone standing behind the shooter or injure the shooter if it reflected off a wall, which is exactly why crews were drilled to fire only from an open doorway or window. A second myth treats the Panzerfaust as one unchanging weapon rather than a fast-evolving family of at least 5 versions produced across barely 2 years. What it left behind reshaped infantry warfare for the rest of the century. German industry produced it in numbers that reportedly ran into the millions of units, dwarfing the bazooka's total output by a wide margin. Captured stockpiles and captured design plans spread the idea even further once the fighting stopped. Finland bought tens of thousands of them before the war ended to help hold off Soviet armor on its own front. Poland fielded thousands of captured examples into the post-war years under its own designation, and American and Soviet units alike simply picked up abandoned Panzerfausts in the war's final weeks and used them against their original owners. Plans for an unfinished, longer-ranged version fell into both American and Soviet hands as Germany collapsed, and those plans fed directly into early post-war work on the Soviet Union's own disposable anti-tank rockets, a lineage running in a fairly straight line toward the shoulder-fired RPG-7 still carried by armies, militias, and irregular fighters around the world today. West Germany's own post-war army later revived the name entirely for the Panzerfaust III, a reloadable Cold War weapon that shared nothing mechanically with the wartime original beyond its reputation. And the same basic concept, a cheap, disposable, shaped charge tube that any infantryman can fire once and throw away, still shows up in modern armies in weapons like the American AT-4. Back in Aachen, the tank the young German soldier fired at burns out in the middle of the street, and the rest of the column stops well short of the wreckage, unwilling to guess how many more men like him are waiting ahead. What Hassag's engineers built into that cheap steel tube was never meant to win the war on its own, and by the autumn of 1944 it plainly was not going to. It was meant to make every meter of open ground in front of a Sherman feel like a gamble, and for one final brutal year of the war, that is exactly the fear it delivered. Extraordinary machines, a cause that deserved to lose. That contradiction is the whole story.